Hari Om, everyone. I'm Sathvika Krishnan. I'll start with a small song, a Carnatic Kriti, in the ragam Amrita Varshini. It's called Yennai Ni Maravadai, and it's about goddess Parvati Meenakshi Angayar Kanni, and it's in the ragam Amrita Varshini. And this is a very beautiful ragam because it's associated with monsoon and rainfall. And given that today I'm going to be talking about nature, and whilst I'm waiting for the tech to hopefully work, I thought we could start with this.
நாட்டினிலே மக்கள் வாழ்வு சிறந்திட நலங்கள் எல்லாம் தந்து அருள்பவளே. நாட்டினிலே மக்கள் வாழ்வு சிறந்திட நலங்கள் எல்லாம் தந்து அருள்பவளே. பாட்டினிலே இசை, பாட்டினிலே இசை, பாட்டினிலே இசை பாட்டினிலே இசை கூட்டியன கழித்த பாட்டினிலே இசை கூட்டியன கழித்த பாட்டினிலே இசை கூட்டியன கழித்த பாட்டினிலே இசை கூட்டியன கழித்த பைந்தமிழ் செல்வியே பாண்டியன் மகளே பைந்தமிழ் செல்வியே பாண்டியன் மகளே பைந்தமிழ் செல்வியே பாண்டியன் மகளே பைந்தமிழ் செல்வியே பாண்டியன் மகளே என்னை நீ மறவாதே அங்கையர் கண்ணி என்னை நீ மறவாதே
So the reason I started with that kriti is because it's in dedication to Angayir Kanni, she with the eyes shaped like fish, so already a link to nature. And like I said, the ragam, Amrita Varshini, Amritam, like nectar, Varshini, the ragam that brings in rainfall, such an integral part of all aspects of the natural world. So even in ancient classical music, Indian classical music, we have this reverence and link to nature, which is what I'll be talking about today. I'll maybe just turn my screen so you can potentially see it there. So the project that I'm working on is called Bhūmi Spirit, and it aims to bring nature back and make nature sacred again, without sounding too much like Donald Trump, trying to make nature sacred again. So I'll start with a small invocation to Bhumi Mata, Bhumi Devi, Mother Earth. I'll actually come on to this again later on, but we'll start. If you know it, please join in. Om Samudravasane Devi Parvatastana Mandale Vishnupatni Namastubhyam Padasparsham Shamasvame Om. So, as a brief introduction, Bhumi Spirit is a kind of environmental educational curriculum that we are designing at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. And it's funded by the Nand and Jeet Khemka Foundation. And it's a project that's not just about education, but it's about research and outreach. And like I say, bringing nature back into our life and making it sacred again, but through a Dharmic lens, so thinking about Hindu mythology, Hindu philosophy, and kind of this Indic view of the world. So that's funded, like I say, by the Nand and Jeet Khemka Foundation. Our primary funder is Mr. Uday Khemka. He's a philanthropist, and his wife, Dr. Nitya Khemka. And it was their idea. Uday kind of came to OCHS about a year ago to the day with this idea that Hindu philosophy and mythology and these kind of Dharmic principles are so rich in what we now consider environmental ideas. We should really push this forward, bring it back, and more importantly, educate young people so they have not just the kind of scientific tools, but the philosophical tools and skills needed to deal with the environmental crises that we're facing today. And this project is facilitated by the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, which is the academic research institute and educational institute located in the University of Oxford. And the project itself has kind of two lead researchers. The first is Natasha Chawla, who is pursuing a PhD at the University of Oxford with the theology department. Her research looks at environmental ethics, specifically eco-philosophy, and she's looking at the works of Tagore and understanding the knowledge-action gap. We know so much about the environmental problems, and yet we're not doing enough. Why does that occur from a philosophical point of view? The second co-leader is myself, Sathvika Krishnan. I am doing a PhD in biology. Actually, my research is with the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit, but my master's looked at the intersect between religion and attitudes towards tiger conservation in India. So I love tigers, I love wildlife. David Attenborough has always been my hero. I have like David Attenborough socks and everything. So I really, I've always been into nature and bird watching, but I've also got this interest. I grew up with Chinmaya Mission, as did Natasha. I've got this interest in understanding Dharmic values as well. And Miss Isha Khemka is our research assistant. She's Uday and Nitya's daughter, and she has got a great interest in environmental philosophy as well. So I thought I'd start by talking about the pañcamahābhūtas. So pancha, 5, maha, great, bhutas, elements. So within Hindu philosophy, we have an understanding that everything around us is nature. Everything is prakriti, right? We have prakriti and purusha. Prakriti makes up the entire universe, cosmos, everything that we are is nature. And this is actually, for Western environmentalists, quite a profound idea, that we are part of nature, that we are not apart from nature. But actually, in Indic philosophy, this is the core, the substratum that we all understand, right? And we have a profound understanding as well that this prakriti is made up of 5 key elements, the pañcamahābhūtas. So we start with akasha, the kind of space, the ether. Then we have vayu, air, agni, which is fire, jal, which is water, and then prithvi, which is earth. Okay, it's fine, I'll just hold this up instead. So we have an understanding that these pañcamahābhūtas make up everything that we see, make up this whole universe, the prakriti around us. And yet, today, nature faces huge problems, huge environmental problems. We're seeing wildfires, we're seeing ice caps melting, we're seeing habitat loss, species loss, not just at a micro scale, but at a macro scale across the globe. So we know Earth is in danger, and as a scientist, this is pretty much all I study. And we have 2 main drivers of ecological collapse. The first is climate change, which I'm sure many, if not all of you, have come across. The second is biodiversity loss. Now, this is climate change's kind of less well-known cousin, but it's the one that I'm kind of more interested in. And I'm going to talk about both in detail in the next few slides. So climate change. What is climate change? It's described as a persistent change in the climate state identifiable by shifts in the mean or variability, and it lasts decades or longer. Sorry, a lot of noise. And this okay, good. And this definition was put forward by the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, which is the large kind of consortium of scientists who research climate change, and this is the definition they've put forward. But what does it really mean in practice? I'm sure most of you are familiar with the idea of global warming and probably have used climate change and global warming interchangeably. That's not really true, because global warming forms part of the definition of climate change. Global warming is the rising global surface temperatures that's caused by greenhouse gas emissions. So greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, so all those cars out there are contributing to that. And what they do is it kind of forms a blanket around the Earth, and that elevates the temperature. So that's global warming. But the second part to climate change is extreme weather events. So this is things like floods, droughts, wildfires, tornadoes, hurricanes. And we're seeing more and more of these events happening across our Earth. In Pakistan last year, there were the high levels of floods. California, the wildfires, droughts across India, Punjab, Rajasthan, these are just to name a few. And it's the combination of global warming and weather shifts, that's what we call climate change. What causes climate change? So with both climate change and biodiversity loss, the underlying causal factor is humans. That's just quite obvious. But we call these causes caused by humans anthropogenic pressures. And the primary anthropogenic pressures that cause climate change are from agricultural usage, mainly farming intensification. So beef farming, cattle farming, that all requires a lot of land, so they have to cut down the land, cut down the trees, and therefore you're contributing more to climate change. Deforestation, as a result. Use of fossil fuel, so that's what causes the kind of further emission of greenhouse gases. And in addition to that, kind of habitat modification in general. So the three main drivers are deforestation, agricultural intensification, and the usage of fossil fuels. These three cause the emission of greenhouse gases, which form this blanket around the atmosphere, which in turn causes climate change. So why is it important to mitigate climate change? By limiting global warming and the associated ramifications caused into the kind of weather, the realm of weather, it has lots of benefits. Firstly, it increases the kind of human health overall. When we're thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, that really impacts not just respiratory health, cardiovascular health, but overall human well-being, mental health included. It also strengthens ecosystem services. So these are the kinds of provisions that nature gives us. So it's not just food and water, but medicinal resources, climate stability, water stability, air stability, everything Bhumi Mata gives us. But with climate change, those ecosystem services decrease. Limiting global warming also will reduce biodiversity loss, which I'll come on to later. And it's really important that we limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So some of you may have come across something called the Paris Agreement. So this was a multilateral environmental agreement put forward in 2015, where it states that nations should try and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Now that might seem like a very negligible amount and a kind of arbitrary number, but it's chosen because if we limit heating to 1.5 degrees, we not only reduce these kind of long-term impacts of climate change and global warming, but we avoid multiple climate tipping points. So when we cross a tipping point, that means what we've done is irreversible. So by hitting 1.5 degrees, we prevent us falling further and further down this kind of spiral of climatic disaster. So this was ratified in the Paris Agreement in 2015. However, one of the major polluters, the US, pulled out recently due to a change of administration that I'm sure we're all very aware of. That's why I truly believe it's the kind of power of young people in the next generation to prevent further decline of the climate and the atmosphere. And I mean, you guys can't see this graph, but it basically shows you how when we limit the warming to 1.5 degrees, how we can limit the greenhouse gas emissions and how that's really beneficial for the planet's health overall. So that's climate change. The second ecological driver is biodiversity loss. And like I said, this is the area that I'm most interested in as a biodiversity scientist myself. So what is biodiversity loss? Well, first let's start with the definition of biodiversity. So biodiversity is a portmanteau of the words biological diversity. So it's kind of two words smashed together. And it describes the variety and variability of life on Earth. So from like the crawling ant to the leaping antelope to the fungi to the bacteria to you and I to everything. Everything living falls under this word biodiversity. And we are losing biodiversity at an unprecedented rate. In fact, in 2022, the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, together with the Zoological Society of London, calculated that we have lost 73% of all vertebrate populations between the years 1970 to 2022. So that is a staggeringly high loss of biodiversity. And this loss of biodiversity includes extirpation, so that's local extinction, but also extinction overall, the complete loss, wipeout of a species. And it's predicted today that over 44,000 species are threatened with extinction. How is this occurring? Again, anthropogenic pressures. Primarily, the main drivers of biodiversity loss are habitat modification, so deforestation, changing habitats and landscapes for human greed. Overexploitation, so that's overhunting, overfishing, overpoaching. Climate change, again, climate change is a driver of biodiversity loss. They work synergistically. Pollution. When we think of pollution, we often think of plastic pollution, and we may think of that image of, like, I think it's a seahorse with its tail wrapped around a cotton bud. But actually, pollution is way more than that. It's sound pollution. They gave a great example of that earlier. It's light pollution, it's noise pollution, it's air pollution. It's so many different types of pollution that we are causing. And then the final driver is invasive alien species. So this is not a super well-known example of a driver, but it's basically where you take a non-native species and move it to, again, anthropogenically introduced to an area that it's not really from, and it can then wipe out the native species. So a great example of this is in our gardens here. We have the gray squirrel. Gray squirrel is American. It's not British at all. Actually, the British squirrel is the red squirrel, and the gray squirrel came along, brought over during trade and export, and it brought over loads of diseases and wiped out the red squirrel population. So that's why invasive alien species are a less well-known but very important driver of biodiversity loss. So why is it important to limit biodiversity loss? Well, actually, it's not just important to limit it, we also need to reverse the loss of nature. And this is because nature gives us everything. Bhumi Mata gives us everything, like we just discussed. Biodiversity gives us all these essential ecosystem services: water regulation, climate regulation, food, medicinal resources. If we think of Ayurveda, that's all from plants. That is biodiversity inherently. So it's necessary for human survival. Selfishly, we need to think about, we can't exist if biodiversity doesn't exist, because we are part of biodiversity. And again, it goes back to this, well, essentially Indic idea that we are Prakriti and we are part of nature. So to reverse and halt biodiversity loss, governments have put forward something called 30 by 30. And this was put forward in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework 2 years ago now. And it's basically an ambition to protect 30% of the Earth's wild spaces by the year 2030. And in only doing so, can we truly reverse and halt biodiversity loss. And again, you guys probably can't see this graph, but it basically shows you how we are really losing nature at a catastrophic rate, that black line. And if we continue as business as usual, we'll go all the way down here. We'll be nature negative. But what we're aiming to do is reach a state of nature positivity, where nature can come back. So we know that nature is all around us, that it's so inherent to our very survival, and yet, like we've said at the start, we're facing these two calamitous issues. And I spoke about the causes as anthropogenic pressures, greenhouse gas emissions, industrialization, intensification. But actually, when we think about it, what causes these anthropogenic pressures? The root cause of all these issues is not a scientific reason or, a kind of, a financial reason. It actually all comes down to 3 values-based issues. Firstly, selfishness. Secondly, greed. And the third is apathy. We want more, we need more, we take more. That's why we're selfish, that's why we're greedy. But we also seem to not care, or not act even if we pretend to care. We're apathetic. And this was first identified by Gus Speth, James Gustav Speth, who's an environmental lawyer at the University of Yale. And I'll just read out the quote because you guys probably can't see it. He said, "I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that." So he rightly identified that this is not actually a science-based problem. Although all the leading biologists and environmentalists are scientists, it's actually not it's not a scientific problem. It's a cultural and spiritual problem. And that's where Bhumi Spirit comes. Because, as I said, Bhumi Spirit aims to inspire practical action and educate young people to care and love for the planet and our natural world through Dharmic values and philosophies. And within Bhumi Spirit as a project overall, we have 3 core themes: education, research, and outreach. And I'm going to primarily focus on the education branch for this talk. So within the education pillar of Bhumi Spirit, we have kind of 3 broad areas. We have curriculum modules, so we're designing a new environmental curriculum. We also have teacher training, because it's all well and good creating these curricula, but who disseminates that information? The guru is as important as the shishya. So teaching teachers how to teach, which is a bit of a tongue twister, but teaching teachers and making sure they're equipped with the right knowledge and skills to disseminate this information is equally as important. And then extending this further, having summer schools, having this rolled out at state, national curriculum, bringing this to as many people as possible. So within the modules, we've got kind of like a modular focus, and it really seems, the main aim is to integrate these universal values that have Dharmic origin, but can be applied and adopted by anyone to these ecological issues. And it's really uniting storytelling with ecology. And the overall aim is to combine head, heart, and hand. And this is a metaphor for knowledge, loving, and action. Because ultimately, you need all three to really change the world. So we've been working not just on designing this curriculum, but piloting it as well. Because it's all well and good like having this on a nice Google spreadsheet or in a Google Drive, but actually we need to test it. So we've been working on 2 modules already, and we've piloted them in 2 schools in the UK. So the Avanti House Primary School in Stanmore and the Balaji Vidyalaya. So we've done 2 pilots, and we're currently working on the 3rd. And we're also going to be piloting some of the modules in India, in Patiala district in Naba, because that's where the Khemka Foundation are located, but also in inner city schools in Delhi, but also elite capture schools in Delhi as well. Additionally, we're working on creating these teacher training kind of modules to accompany the modular curriculum that we have. So the way we've structured the modules is actually how I started the talk, with the pañcamahābhūtas. So we have a module for Prithvi, for Jal, for Agni, for Vayu, and Akash. And the way the modules are structured is we have lesson plans for each module, and the lesson plans are structured like this. We look at a thematic area within each of the pañcamahābhūtas, and we look at the ecology or the science or the scientific problems associated with that. And we try and connect this to Hindu mythology, and then find these universal yet dharmic values that can incite the necessary action, and then we do actions or activities to kind of link everything together. So for an example, if we look at the Prithvi module, we had 5 lessons for that, and one of the lessons went sort of like this. The thematic area that we looked at was terrestrial biodiversity loss. So terrestrial means on land biodiversity loss. And we started by explaining the concept of biodiversity. There was actually a video of David Attenborough speaking because I had to bring him into the lesson. So we looked at this kind of science of what biodiversity is, why biodiversity loss is so important, and damaging. And then we linked this to Hindu mythology. And we kind of looked at the biodiversity of Hinduism. Because when we look at stories within kind of the Hindu mythological canon, it's full of not just animals, but plants and insects and birds and mammals. The whole kind of variety of taxon that exists, we see in Hindu mythology. And we really wanted to emphasize this in the lesson. So I spoke about Jatayu. Everyone knows who Jatayu is, right? Familiar character. He's in the Ramayana, very noble, wise bird who tried to save Sita as Ravana was taking her away. Jatayu is actually a vulture, and some of you may have used the word vulture as a bit of a derogatory term to describe someone you don't like or someone who may steal your ideas or be a bit of a pest. But actually, vultures are incredibly important members and components of ecosystems. If we look at what a vulture does in the ecosystem, they clean up dead bodies. They decompose all kind of detritus. They give back to nature. And yet, in the Western world at least, we use it as such a kind of derogatory term. But when we look at the Hindu mythological canon, we have Jatayu, this noble, wise, brave creature who is a vulture. And this is even more pertinent, and I love this, because in India, vulture populations were basically decimated. From the late 60s to only very recently, the population went down by 98%, almost 99%. And this is because farmers were using diclofenac, which is an anti-inflammatory drug for their cattle, and the vultures would eat the cattle, and it'll bioaccumulate, and then they'll die. And what we were seeing in India is because of the loss of vultures, human health was also being impacted. Rodent populations started to increase. Zoonotic diseases started to spread. And because of the groups of conservationists working with cultural and spiritual storytelling, the vulture populations are now on the rise. So if we look at this, I don't know if you guys can see it, but if we look at this kind of image, it shows you the IUCN species status kind of classification. So the IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And they put forward these kind of classifications for how we can group species depending on their populations. It goes from complete extinction to least concern. And vultures were literally sitting at critically endangered. There was barely hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals remaining. Now, because of these concerted conservation efforts that are linked to kind of cultural storytelling, we are now in kind of endangered / vulnerable region. But that's after a lot of like conservation effort. But the reason I like to tell this story is because within, again, I say this kind of the Ramayana, a core Hindu story, we have such an important character be a vulture, something that we consider useless or ugly or disgusting. So yeah, so we look at the kind of like biodiversity within Hinduism, not just deities or characters like Jatayu, but also Vahanas, sacred plants like Tulasi Ma, and other kind of deities. We then link this to Dharmic values, and the core Dharmic value that we bring most of our lessons back to is the idea of Rita. Rita is interconnectedness, it's cosmic order. It appears in the Rig Veda. One of the earliest kind of principles is actually posited in the Rig Veda. And we love this idea of Rita because it very much mirrors what biodiversity is. This idea of interconnectedness, this idea of a web of life. And if you pull one thing away, the entire thing collapses. You get anrita. When you have adharma, you have anrita. And we try and explain this not just through the idea of Rita, but through the idea of biodiversity as well. Within this lesson, we also looked at the idea of ahimsa, which many people think is non-violence, but it's actually the path to least violence. And also loka sangraha, acting with the welfare of the world in mind. Because that's what biodiversity is. Every node in the ecosystem, every component of the web of life has an equal part to play. And that's when you work to prevent biodiversity loss, you're acting with the welfare of the world in mind. Then we link this to actions and activities because, again, the children that we're speaking to are around 10 to 12 years old. They don't want to be sat doing nothing, so we try and get them engaged. And one of the activities we do is called Rita Rope, where we get all the children kind of like in a matrix, and we ascribe each child a node in an ecosystem. So one is a leaf, one is an insect, one is a fungi, one is a dog or whatever. And we make them hold a rope and show all the connections between everyone. And what we do is they hold the rope really tight, and when it's taut, the whole ecosystem is present. You can see Rita. But when you take even just one individual out, even if it's just a fungi or the leaf litter or a tree, the entire ecosystem collapses. So it really shows you Anrita in action. So that's why we call it Rita rope, because it mirrors this idea of biodiversity loss. In this class, we also gave children tulasi seeds because we told them the story of Tulasi Ma, and again, we wanted them to have this kind of personal connection. So now there's a class in Birmingham, and they've all got little tulasi plants that they've grown over the past few weeks because of this lesson. And then we also want them to get outside and really see nature, but connect it to technology, because every child today has a phone or has access to a phone. So we had a nature photography competition where they had to go outside and take a really beautiful photo of nature and write about why they really wanted to take that picture. So in doing so, I hope you can see that the structure of each class kind of echoes this idea I mentioned earlier of uniting head, knowing, heart, loving, with hands, action. The core of all our classes comes back to Dharma. Now, I'm sure, as many of you know, if you look at the Oxford Sanskrit Dictionary, the word Dharma has about 10 pages worth of definition, so it's very difficult to define. But the root dra means to sustain, to uphold. And that's fundamental to all environmental action. But we've come up with a slightly altered version of Dharma. It's called eco-Dharma. So this is the application of universal values of Hindu origin to an environmental/nature-based context. And within eco-Dharma, we try to echo this idea of ekatva, the oneness of Brahman exists within all beings, non-living, living, movable, immovable. This idea of Brahman exists within everything. And by kind of understanding that, you sustain Rita, cosmic order, which in turn is preserved by Dharmic action, which in this context is eco-Dharmic action. And we really try to kind of push this idea through every class so that every student really understands this. Again, it's all well and good knowing and loving, but actually we need to do things. So we've come up with this term called eco-seva, which we call ES, and it's quite funny because ecosystem services in academic literature is also called ES. But it's this idea of serving Bhumi Mata through environmentally conscious actions. So seva, the idea of acting and selfless service, but again with this kind of environmental lens. And we present this through the idea of the pancharanas. So the Pancharinas are debts, cosmic, karmic, spiritual debts that we all have as humans. And there are 5, so the Pancha meaning 5, debts that we need to repay through our life. The first is Devarina, so debt to God. The second is Rishirina, debt to teachers, rishis and gurus. The third is Pitrurina, so that's your debt to your ancestors and your family and your parents. The fourth is Manushyarina, so that's debt to humanity. And the fifth is Bhutarina, and that's the one we focus on. The idea of repaying debt to Bhumi Mata through eco-seva. And again, linking eco-seva to eco-dharma and dharmic action, and understanding the value of ekatva and rita, all of these connected. And this is a kind of principle that we echo across all of our lessons, across all of the modules. So I've been mentioning Bhumi Mata a lot. She has many names, Bhumi Devi, Bhumi Mata, Mother Earth, Prithvi. But this idea of a goddess Earth or a Mother Earth is not unique to Hinduism. The Romans had the goddess Terra, the Greeks had Gaia, I think, the Incans have Pachamama, but we have Bhumi Mata. And actually her last name, Prithvi, comes from King Prithu. So this is a story in the Bhagavatam. And it's a story that we actually tell the children when we talk about soil and agriculture. And this is because King Prithu, he had a happy kingdom, everyone was great, and he was a good man, a good king. But the people were just kind of enjoying life. They weren't really doing anything for Bhumi Mata. And then one day they were faced with a terrible drought. They lost all their crops, they lost all their agriculture, they lost all their food. And Bhumi Mata came to King Prithu and said, look, you can't just keep taking from me, you need to give, and only then can I reward you with the fruits of my ground. Otherwise, you'll face a drought. So then King Prithu went out to the fields himself and plowed the land by hand himself. And this is, kind of a juxtaposition. A king shouldn't be acting like a farmer, but he knew that was his dharma. And because he did this and he plowed the land, Bhumi Mata returned with all the fruits and all the harvest, and the nation was happy again. And that's why Bhumi Mata is often called Prithvi, because she's the daughter of King Prithu. And we tell the story because we try and emphasize this idea of kind of agricultural intensification and how we are exploiting Mother Earth and trying just to take and take. Again, this idea of selfishness. But actually, when you take care of the land and you ensure that you love Bhumi Mata, she will return with the harvest. So I will go back to what we started with, the Bhumi Namaskaram Stotram. And I'll just say what the meaning is, because I find the meaning so fascinating and so beautiful. So, Samudra Vasane Devi, she who wears the oceans as her clothes. Parvatastana Mandale, whose body is the mountains, whose breath is the mountains, whose body is the rocks. Vishnu Patni Namastubhyam, I bow down to the wife of Vishnu. Padasparsham Shamasvame, and this is the most interesting part to me. In Hinduism, we have or in ancient Indian culture, or in Indian culture in general, we have this very basic understanding that we would never put our feet on God, on an idol, or on a murti, or a photo of God, or even a pen, or a book. And yet, every day when we wake up, we put our feet on Bhumi Mata. So that last line, Padasparsham Shamasvame, I apologize for putting my feet on you every day. So if there's even just one thing you take away from my talk, I really hope it's this. I implore you all to, when you wake up in the morning, the first thing you do, to say this shlokam and really, truly apologize to Bhumi Mata for putting your feet on her every day. Because you wouldn't never think to do that if it's a photo of Ganesha or, I don't know, my bag or something. But we do this every day with Bhumi Mata, someone we consider to be this all-loving, all-knowing goddess. So I'll just say it line by line, and if we could all repeat, that would be great. Om Samudravasane Devi, Samudravasane Devi, Parvatastana Mandale, Parvatastana Mandale, Vishnu Patni Namastubhyam, Vishnu Patni Namastubhyam, Padasparsham Shamasvame, Padasparsham Shamasvame. So we'll all say it together once.
Om Samudravasane Devi Parvatastana Mandale Vishnupatni Namastubhyam Padasparsham Kshamasvame. So yeah, if there's just one thing you take away, I really hope it's this. It's my New Year's resolution to say it every morning, and so far I've stuck to my resolution, so I hope you all do too. And we teach this shlokam to the children. We start and end every class with it, so they're all familiar with the meaning. They all know how to say it, and many of them have actually told me that when they wake up in the morning, they've started to do it as well. So yeah, it kind of links on to my next point, which is it's, again, all well and good talking about this and sharing my module and these ideas with you, but it actually has to work in practice. So here's some feedback that we've received from these kids. This is a quote. "I have absolutely loved these sessions. They are interesting, fun, and very informative. They have taught me things that I will always use in the future." Another child said, "I have found these lessons very useful as they have taught me things about nature through spiritual ways. I really appreciate these lessons as they are fun and interactive." And I've actually got a photo of all these kids writing that they're rating us 5 stars. I didn't ask them, I didn't pay them to do it. They did it off their own volition. So the feedback is really good and it's really positive. But for us, it's also important to see empirical impact. So we have conducted an impact assessment. So we deploy a survey before the children take the Bhūmi Spirit module, and then after, so after 5 weeks. And we're actually seeing huge attitudinal and perception shifts. So this bar chart kind of shows the pre-Bhūmi Spirit, so that's on the left-hand side, and the post-Bhūmi Spirit on the right-hand side. And the question we asked them was, you know, how do they know much about Hindu nature stories or stories about nature and Hinduism? And before Bhūmi Spirit, about 28% said they didn't know any stories, about 53% said they knew some stories, and 18% said, yeah, they knew a few stories. After the 5 weeks, we didn't get anyone saying that they didn't know any stories, and 68% that they said they knew some stories, and 31% said that they knew quite a few stories. This graph shows, we asked them the question about how often do they act with the environment in mind. And on the left-hand scale, so the lower values say very rarely, and on the higher end, the upper values say more frequently. And before Bhūmi Spirit, we had ranging all the way from low to a few saying high. Whereas after Bhūmi Spirit, we have no students rating it low. Everyone's rating it from 3, 4, and 5. So they're acting more frequently with the environment in mind after 5 weeks of Bhūmi Spirit. And then this kind of the 2 donut plots here show how did children want to learn more about their cultural connection to nature? So we asked them, would you like to know more? And before Bhūmi Spirit, some said no, a few said maybe, and like 65% said yes. After Bhūmi Spirit, only 10% said yes, and everyone else, 90% said, 10% said maybe, and 90% said yes. That would have been terrible if it was the other way around. So again, a huge shift. All these children really wanted to learn more. They were more invested, even ones who really didn't really care, like they voted no. They changed their mind. They wanted to learn more about their cultural connection to nature. So that brings me on to the future of Bhūmi Spirit. We're still, these 3 core aims, education, research, and outreach, are really kind of what we're focusing on. So in terms of education, we're actually starting the next pilot next week. And like I say, we're hopefully going to roll this out as state-based curriculum, hopefully starting in Punjab and Rajasthan. And then, you know, we'll see, but maybe nationally adopted curricula in India. In terms of research, we're partnering with Brown University and obviously University of Oxford and conducting some ethnobiological kind of anthropological studies to again see how children view nature through this Hindu Dharmic lens and how cultural values impact environmental action and how this can really be linked to heat and climate adaptation in Naba in Patiala district, Punjab. And outreach, so this is an outreach event, but also on the 5th of June, we are hosting a launch of Bhūmi Spirit at the High Commission in the Nehru Centre in India, in London, so the High Commission of India. And this will involve some panel events and some kind of more presentations and discussions, and hopefully some of the children will also be there to share their views. And we're still working out the details at the moment, but this will be kind of the first formal launch of Bhumi Spirit. So I have a kind of group activity planned now, but before then, does anyone have any questions? We can do questions and then the group activity.
We already have a pretty
Oh.
so, please.
How old were the children that you're educating?
So the pilot is for year sixes at the moment, so about 10 to 11 years old. But what we really would like is from toddlers to university students, and I mean anyone. The Bhumi Spirit is not restricted by age, but in terms of the modules at the moment, we're working with year sixes, hopefully going to expand that further.
So Sathvika, first of all, very, very nice, very structured talk, and thank you for giving us the insight. Secondly, I'm a bit curious to know about what analgesic, what painkiller are farmers using for the cattle, because it was an inadvertent loss of vultures which was happening through use of diclofenac for the cattle as a painkiller drug. So is there any alternative that they are using, and that's why vulture population is going up now, or what's the alternative that they are using now?
I quite frankly don't know the medical side or pharmacological side. I do think what farmers were invited to do was to actually just burn the carcasses rather than leave them out. And that was a behavioral change incited by conservationists, because when you leave the carcasses out, the vultures are just going to come. Whereas when you burn them, you're limiting the chances of any kind of bioaccumulation happening. I don't know if another anti-inflammatory drug was used. I will do some research. I will explore some scientific journals and get back to you, Uncle.
Yeah, because if they are burning the carcasses, then what food are they using as an alternative again? I mean,
the vultures.
Vultures, yeah. Because vultures are actually feeding themselves on these decomposing carcasses. So
I mean, I think like they do eat. They eat dogs. They eat humans as well. Like there was actually a point where you couldn't, in certain streets in India, you couldn't walk because human carcasses were piling up because people were just relying on vultures to get rid of them. So maybe there's a change in food source, or there's a change in the anti-inflammatory drugs that they're using.
Thanks for a great talk. So all of us here today, what could we do going forward to help the environment on a day-to-day simplistic way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the best thing that actually anyone can do for the environment is to be vegetarian or vegan. Adopting a plant-based diet, which I think many of you will be already doing, so I'm kind of preaching to the choir. But adopting a plant-based diet is actually the best thing you can do, because agricultural intensification for cattle ranching is the primary driver of not only greenhouse gas emissions, but also biodiversity loss. So having a plant-based diet is great. I would actually recommend more people going vegan. I've only been vegan for a few months, but actually the dairy industry is really terrible, not just in terms of animal ethics, but also environmental kind of values as well. Other kind of small, simple actions, supporting local biodiversity. We often think of biodiversity as something far away that happens in like forests in India or Ecuador or, I don't know, in South Africa. But actually we have local biodiversity here. So having a small bowl, which you change every day, full of water, especially in the summer months, is really important. Certain types of bird food, the RSPB have just announced new bird food regulations, so I'd recommend reading that. But having like bird food, not owning pet cats is really good, apparently, for local biodiversity. But I also think just knowing more and finding out more about nature, not just in terms of, what's on the news, but digging more about how you can change your own life. If you look at your own life, what small changes can I make to act more environmentally friendly? And supporting charities that do environmental work is also really good. I recommend Reserva, the Youth Land Trust, which is a charity I'm part of. We've basically created the world's first fully youth-funded nature reserve in Ecuador, and now we're working in Panama as well. So donating to environmental charities is really good as well.
Yeah, can I first of all thank you very much for a brilliant talk. I think it was really, really instructive and has many different dimensions. I have a question about Parsis. leaving their bodies out in these towers of silence, and then the vultures come and eat them. Did you come across that? I'm sure.
I mean, I can't say I have. I mean, my knowledge of vultures is not, it's purely kind of ornithological.
But it fits with
Yeah.
They take care of polluting substances.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, vultures, like I say, are super integral parts of the ecosystem. And in fact, fun fact about their evolution, lots of birds will have feathers on their heads, vultures don't. And that's why people say they look ugly and they look bald. But it's actually because, I mean, if you were a vulture, you wouldn't want your hair to get full of blood and gore and carcasses, right? And so that they are completely evolved for that purpose in the ecosystem. But yeah, it completely makes sense, the kind of body contribution to the ecosystem.
Yes. The second question would be, you talk about motivating kids to do this at certain level. Are you going to university level?
So, yeah, well, I mean, right now there's only two of us, Natasha and I, so we're trying to we're trying to focus in on kids, because ultimately they are the future of tomorrow, the future of today, I guess. With university students within the Oxford Hindu Society, I've run like brief discussions about how to kind of, this idea of eco-dharma, but we would like to have a kind of more formalized curriculum within the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, kind of new curriculum structure that will be targeted towards university students, but also through informal medium and channels, for example, videos or podcasts, so that it's not always just like formal curricula or formal education, because ultimately this knowledge and what we're doing and what we're cultivating shouldn't be exclusionary. It should be accessible to as many people as possible. So again, using technology to bring it to as many people like university students.
I have a question for you. So based on the success or otherwise of carbon credits, where are we going with one of your main areas of research, which is biodiversity credits? Can you talk about that?
That's a great question. I think about that like 5 days a week.
I'm sure.
So for those of you who don't know, there's a credit system that is being adopted. It's a financial mechanism to either offset or limit carbon emissions. So those are carbon credits. Biodiversity credits work similarly, where you can basically purchase a credit to offset the impact you are having on biodiversity. With carbon, it's easier, because if I produce 1 ton of carbon in Nuneaton, I can sink it in Chennai, and it's the same. It's the same ton of carbon. Whereas with biodiversity, it doesn't work the same, because biodiversity is inherently multifaceted and multidimensional. So my research actually focuses on using single species as the indicator for biodiversity financial mechanisms like credits, but also bonds. So like a government-issued bond, you get tax credits. In the same way, depending on the species population, you can get your returns with your principal capital returned back to you. But it's all very hypothetical at the moment, so I'm actually designing a credit for tigers in India, Bhutan, and Thailand. But I feel bad doing it, because you have to put like a financial kind of value, but unfortunately that's the kind of late-stage capitalistic world that we live in, where you inherently have to do that.
So following up though, how is that going to work, the biodiversity credits, briefly?
So biodiversity credits work where you can either purchase a credit that's directly linked to what you've done. So let's say I'm a developer in Brazil and I cut 15 acres of land. You can then protect 15 acres of land, 15 hectares or acres of land elsewhere within Brazil, but that's called a biodiversity credit because they're using an indicator species to measure the success. So if you look at, there's a product called Savimbo, and they focus on jaguars. But that's fine if I live in Brazil. But if I live in Chennai and I destroy 2 acres of habitat, what use is it? How can I transfer that to Brazil? So that's where the difficulty comes in. So credits are a little bit touchy. I think bonds may work better, or things like NFTs. NFTs are non-fungible tokens, which became very popular about a couple of years ago. And again, these are all financial mechanisms that could bring money into conservation. Ultimately, my aim is to draw money into conservation, but also support the communities that live alongside these species. Because again, it's all well and good. Okay, I want to protect some forest in India, and I want the tiger population to do really well. So I'm going to buy 10 tiger credits. But if the people living in that forest are being killed by tigers on a daily basis, then your credit is null. So it's really important to have indigenous people in local communities involved in the design and dissemination and kind of adoption of these credits.
Okay. So I was in Great Nicobar in November last year, and the story going around at the moment is they're going to be building, the Indian government is going to be building a huge port there.
Yeah.
And at the moment, the population of Great Nicobar is about 5,000, projected by 2050 to be 50,000, tenfold, where the ecosystem has stayed virtually still all this time. I mean, I don't see how, with respect, biodiversity credits are going to work when it's government-imposed projects.
I mean, with biodiversity credits and carbon credits for that matter, there are two markets. There is the compulsory market, which is why these multilateral agreements are really important, because through that, governments have to commit. But there's also the voluntary market as well, which is it's a bit more sensitive.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes, okay. Any more questions?
Recently, they also have the biodiversity net gain.
Yeah, BNG.
Is that the same thing you're talking about? Is that different?
So BNG is part of this. Broadly speaking, it's part of nature finance. So it's where developers have to offset or mitigate their biodiversity loss for UK properties. I can tell you that it's not working. It's very bad. The metrics that they're using are very, very poor, very weak, and quite a lot of the time, developers are not working down. It's called a mitigation hierarchy. Ultimately, you don't want to be doing offsetting. You don't want to be damaging the habitat in the first place. But lots of these developers just don't care. So they're like, it's fine.
You have to stop.
Sorry?
You need to stop.
Yeah, exactly. But they don't. So BNG isn't working that well. But it's basically the government's way of hiding the fact that, of pretending to have done really well for biodiversity.